Boldwood presents Lost Luggage, written by Samantha Tonge and read by Gilly Bond. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. The shop's doors swung open, and a crowd jostled Dolly Bell into the small auction house and away from the scents of Manchester's Christmas market. She stuffed a half-eaten white chocolate bar into her rucksack. She'd finish it on the train back to Nottsmere, a village 30 minutes away from the city centre. The Lost Luggage auction took place on the 10th of every month. People were given an hour to inspect the lock cases going under the hammer. Every December, Dolly and Greta attended, and the 2 cases they went home with were gifts for each other, not to be opened until Christmas Day. Unused to people, after the last year, Dolly folded her arms and held her sides as if to stop herself falling apart. Regulars Ben and Joan made their way over to say hello. Joan's charity store always needed clothes, and eagle-eyed eBay seller Ben would bid high for the rarer designer luggage. Neither of them mentioned the obvious. How this time last year Dolly hadn't been able to talk for tears, because she'd visited the auction just 10 days after one fateful afternoon. After 5 brief, tragic minutes that transformed her life forever. Not even one of Joan's toffees had been able to plug the flow, as sobs had convulsed her body. A sense of anticipation rose through Dolly's chest, and she loosened her scarf. On Christmas Day, Greta would rub her hands together and circle the cases, as if she and her sister were vultures. Dolly preferred to think of them as kinder birds, who offered their nest to orphaned belongings. She hadn't been sure about attending the auction this year, and had asked her sister, who was better than her at making decisions. Living together for nigh on 50 years meant you could read each other's faces, and just one look at Greta this morning had given Dolly her answer. The airport held on to lost cases for 6 months or so before passing them on. Dolly inspected this December's selection, laid out on white tables. A practical canvas one, a plastic pull-along covered with stickers, and on from that a bulging polyester holdall. One case, decorated with a pink and pine botanical pattern, caught her eye with its smooth plastic outer shell. The legs of the stool in front of her small dressing table had been coming loose for months. This pretty case, upturned, would provide the perfect replacement chair. Dolly and Greta always upcycled the cases where possible, and had become experts at removing wheels and handles. Yet a bright yellow ribbon caught her attention, tied to a tan steamer trunk that was scratched with a flat top and studded sides. She touched its strong leather straps. Its treasure chest vibe made her think of adventures and the stories behind those scratches. Yet its botanical neighbour was so pretty. Dolly examined both. She couldn't decide. Dolly found seats in the front row of the auction room, the best position for 71-year-old eyes, and sat waiting, her hand on her purse, her open rucksack on her lap, turquoise tea flask in one of the side pockets. Underneath her seat lay detachable suitcase wheels. The 2 sisters always came well prepared. She murmured to Greta that she reckoned luck might be on her side today, although her stomach fluttered, as it always did, until it was the turn of the lot she was interested in. Bids started at £8 unless it was a designer suitcase. Ben had just snagged a Louis Vuitton for 110. As the auctioneer brought forward one of the cases she'd shortlisted, Dolly accepted one of Joan's toffees, struggling to unwrap it, with fingers impatient to start bidding. Quickly the bids increased. £8, 15, 20, 30. Sucking harder on the sweet, Dolly studied the other bidder, a woman with a short red bob and scarlet glasses. Dolly's eyes narrowed. "Call your rival's bluff. Stick to your budget. Quit now." £40, she blurted out. The other woman hesitated for a moment, and then slouched back in her seat as the hammer sounded. "Isn't it handsome, Greta?" said Dolly, back in their bungalow, and she tilted her head, straining her ears with a sense that the trunk had something to say. But she wouldn't discover its secrets until she opened it. Dolly sat down on the sagging rose-pink sofa opposite the front window, a fresh cup of tea on the small table to her right. She changed into her favourite jogging bottoms, soft and creased, with fraying hems. Close to her chest, she hugged a hot water bottle. Greta only approved of turning up the thermostat if the temperature dropped below 16 degrees. The leather trunk posed in the middle of the room, revelling in its air of mystery. Greta was now settled on the armchair to the left, underneath the shelving that housed her books and decorative royal family plates. She wore her usual no-nonsense expression, with her set hair, pleated skirt and string of pearls. "The yellow ribbon cinched it," Dolly said to her. "I can't wait to find out what's inside at Christmas. Only 15 days to wait." She let go of the hot water bottle and dabbed her eyes. Stepping through discarded newspapers and sweet wrappers, she went over to the armchair. Dolly picked up the framed photo, smeared with white chocolate, and stared Greta straight in the face. Chapter 2. Avoiding the two identical circles of beige turkey and tiny rock-hard peas, Dolly cautiously prodded a perfect sphere of stuffing. She hadn't cooked much since Greta passed, and missed the flavours of previous Christmases: spiced mince pies, smelly cheeses, packets of Rennies. Dolly sat in front of the television with the meal on her lap, still in its plastic container. Greta would have tutted. Whilst the Queen spoke of family and community, Dolly gazed at cards on the windowsill, from well-meaning villagers, and a handmade one of a female Santa wearing a superhero mask from little Flo next door. Most had fallen over now. Unable to wait until Her Majesty stopped talking, the usual cue for present opening, she laid her dinner on the floor and hoiked the steamer trunk case over. For many years she'd longed for laminate flooring to get rid of the outdated patterned carpet. But it was only right that Greta had the last say, being more than a decade older than Dolly. "What do you think is in it this year, Maurice?" He'd watched them open every single case since he'd moved in 2011. Maurice carried on eating his peas. Greta had always thought him a moody bugger, as if a goldfish should provide smiles and conversation. Dolly stood up, turned off the television, and went over to a black suitcase, upturned and wedged into the front right corner of the room. It made an excellent stand for the record player. A mahogany cabinet stood next to it, for extra support, against the wall. Dolly moved a couple of dirty mugs off the record player, before lifting its lid, and opened the door of the cabinet. Grunting, she bent over and searched through her collection of old vinyls, until she came across the greatest hits of the Bee Gees. Appropriately, she lowered the needle onto Saturday Night Fever. Through the wall of the tank, she caught Maurice swaying in time to the beat. Unable to remember the last time she'd danced, Dolly ran a hand over the trunk studs before laying it on its side. The auction house removed electrical items and toiletries, selling them off to make extra money, and they shredded personal documents before repacking the cases that people bid for. Every year she'd fantasise about the case's contents. Perhaps they'd discover a really exciting object, like an exquisite antique, a pouch of diamonds, or an unused coffee shop voucher. Yet the reality never disappointed, even when it was just well-worn items only suitable for doing DIY or gardening, or children's and menswear they could pass on to neighbours, Flo and Leroy. At best, they'd find brand new clothes, in their own sizes, that the case's owners had bought for a holiday. Ben had taught Dolly and Greta that it was worth looking up coats and shoes online, designer items sold for a fortune second-hand. She and Greta would try and guess what the owners were like before opening the cases. Dolly stared at the leather straps. This trunk looked masculine, as if it belonged to a traveller who had arms strong enough to carry it a distance when full, a person used to the way the world worked before expandable zippers and spinner wheels. Understated, functional. Yet the studding and the straps had been forged with style. It felt like an old friend. She didn't know why. With fumbling hands, she undid the buckles. Heart thudding quicker than the LP's disco beat, she lifted up the lid and gasped. Dolly had misinterpreted the outside of the case. How unusual! How luxurious! She lifted up the down-filled quilted nylon material, a dusty pink gilet with a maroon collar and hood, a lightweight coat. That made sense, seeing as this case would have been packed earlier in the year. The gilet had pockets and discreet matching buttons down the front, along with a logo in the shape of a letter Z. Untidily, she draped it over the sofa's arm, not noticing it fall onto the carpet. Her eyes darted to a small octopus plushie, bright orange, with a smile on its face. The case's owner might have a child. She turned the plushie inside out to a blue side that wore a sad frown, left it that way, and turned her attention to a sports sweat top with a hood in a lovely shade of mint green. A graphic of a cat's face poked out of a small pocket on the front. Dolly paused before tugging the top over her head. It clung to her body, as if grateful to have a new home. Dolly ran a hand over the soft material, unused to the smell of clean laundry. Next, she took out a pair of white trainers with shiny rose gold heel caps. She held them in the air, marvelling as they shone, lending the lounge an unfamiliar sense of glamour. Like Cinderella, Dolly kicked off her holey slippers and pushed her feet into them. Up and down she paced, in time to the music's beat, like 18-year-old Dolly, who'd lived for nights out in town, dancing and stealing flowers from Piccadilly Gardens because the ones in her hair had wilted. The remaining clothes were all sporty, like a pair of drawstring trousers tapered at the bottom. As decades had passed since the first auction they'd visited in 1985, it had become more difficult to guess the age of owners. Gone were the days when people dressed their age. Dolly had never looked anything like her mum when she was young, but nowadays relatives from different generations could have shared the same fashionable wardrobe. Dolly packed everything back into the case, apart from the sweat top and reversible octopus. She placed the plushie on top of the record player's dusty glass top. Morris might appreciate it. She kept the sweat top on and reached for a plain white notebook she'd fetched from her sister's bedroom. Tattered now, with curled edges, it looked a little brown. In it, over the years, Greta had recorded the contents of every single case they'd brought home. It was time now for Dolly to pick up the mantle. Or, at least, her biro. After scrawling the last item, she took her uneaten Christmas lunch into the kitchen and came back with a thick cheese sandwich and a tube of Pringles. Greta loved notebooks and never threw them out. In her room they were stacked neatly in a corner. Around 10 full of book reviews. She'd read at least 4 novels a month, others full of recipes, and a pile recording everything the two of them had done together on their holiday trips in the UK. Dolly didn't pry, but Greta seemed happy to share the latter. They weren't diaries of their breaks as such, just lists of the restaurants or places of interest they'd seen. "What about jive talking?" she asked Morris, who was looking less perky now that he'd finished the peas, his favourite treat. She went to the record player, moved the plushie, dusted crisp crumbs from her fingers, and lifted up the lid again to turn over the record. Then she knelt down and stared into Morris's eyes, as black as a mermaid's purse, smiling as his tangerine dorsal fin shot back up at the sight of her face. His tank was to the right as you walked into the lounge, away from the window, the radiator, not too near the telly or next to the record player. She'd done her research when she'd agreed to take him off a colleague at work who was moving abroad. Greta would wrinkle her nose and say goldfish only had 3 seconds of memory, but Dolly had never needed Google to tell her this wasn't true. She went to close the trunk, but couldn't resist trying on the gilet, even though it was too small. In the hallway, she stood in front of the mirror. Dolly wiped the glass with the sleeve of the green sports hoodie. The dusty pink colour softened the pinched look of her face, the maroon collar lifting her pasty cheeks. Over the last year, outside, buds had unfurled into green leaves that were outshone by flowers, until trees blazed with their autumn hues, the elements showing off their vibrancy. However, indoors everything had become as grey as February rain, including Dolly's reflection. The hair now more salt than pepper at the roots, the shadows under her eyes deeper. The gilet's buttons wouldn't do up. She dug her hands into the pockets and turned from side to side. Oh, a sheet of paper. Dolly pulled it out of the pocket. A map of the Paris underground. A deep-rooted ache rippled through her. She closed her eyes, forcing away the memory of a trip to that city that was never to be. The owner must have been going to France. Or perhaps they'd just flown home from there. Or maybe Manchester was a stopover. Dolly squinted at the names of stations. Chateau Rouge sounded like wine. Victor Hugo, so romantic. And as for the Champs-Élysées, she'd always wanted to shop along that avenue. Perhaps a Frenchman with a silky accent would treat her to champagne. They'd wander around art galleries. The bubbles inside her produced by opening the case burst into nothing as she thought of all the countries she'd never seen. Greta said Mother Nature would have given people wings and trees that grew pound notes if she'd wanted them to travel to another country. She always spoke such sense, so the two sisters instead enjoyed getaways to all the corners of the UK. Greta happy to fall in with Dolly's choices. Whilst other people wasted money on expensive trips abroad, Greta preferred sensible spending, like on an upgraded burglar alarm. Dolly carefully folded the map up again and slid it back into the pocket. Legs heavy, she plodded back into the lounge and took off the gilet. She dropped it back into the trunk on top of the other items and tried to close it. However, the lid resisted, and an urge overwhelmed her. She'd once known someone who owned a similar trunk, and it had a hidden compartment. He'd stash his most loved objects in there, including her love letters. Pushing those memories back into the mental box she rarely opened, Dolly ran a finger around the edge of the felt lining and... She jerked her hand back as her finger found a small tab. She touched it again and gently tugged. It came away. A well-worn white T-shirt was visible first. She unfolded it and held it in the air, trying to make sense of the symbol printed on the front, made up of a long curved line on the right and a shorter one on the left. The latter curled in so that overall both lines formed a heart that was decorated with small blue flowers and green leaves. Dolly folded it up again and reached for a small round leather case. Hidden personal items. Dolly unzipped the case. Inside lay a yellow crystal bracelet and a silver necklace with a ring hanging from it that had a pearl in the middle of a diamond circle. Dolly held it up in the air, mesmerised by the beautiful workmanship. She couldn't resist taking the ring off the chain and sliding it onto her finger, but it wouldn't fit over any knuckle. Finally, right at the bottom, a rectangular item caught her eye. It shimmered as light from the tall lamp at the end of the sofa hit it. A notebook. Greta would have clapped her hands. It was floral, with colours that could have come straight from Monet's water lily paintings, lacquered with a metallic effect. After hesitating, Dolly put on her glasses and opened it. Handwritten in italic were the words, "Phoebe Goodbody's Year of Firsts." Chapter 3. Boxing Day morning. Dolly wriggled into a pair of jeans, the first thing she spotted in her wardrobe, and kept on the hoodie that she'd slept in. Without looking in the mirror, Dolly dragged a brush through her hair, giving up because of the knots. At least a week had passed since she'd last washed it. After sticking her feet into slip-on boots, not bothering with socks, she took down a voluminous brown anorak from the rack in the hall. Despite being a little tighter these days, it acted like an invisibility cloak, especially with the hood that hid her face. Dolly never used to wear it due to a tear under the arm, but with peplum trim around the cuffs and bottom, it was too stylish to throw out. It was the only item she'd kept from her... Yes, the 2015 lost luggage case that had been deep and wide and made an especially good storage box in the loft. Out of curiosity, she'd searched for the gilet online. It was so different to anything Dolly had ever seen. By the collar, on the left, she'd found a size label with the word Zadorin on it. A site popped up and she'd scrolled until she'd found it, in dusty pink and maroon. "Good grief, Morris," she'd stuttered. "It's worth £800. Morris had stopped dead and a pea had popped out of his mouth. She pushed her flask into one of the deep pockets. Dolly had to get outside, had to get away from the temptation of reading the floral notebook that she'd put in the bedside drawer in Greta's room. She hadn't looked further than the title page, and her conscience told her it must stay that way. Its contents were private and none of her business. Despite the big hood, she caught Leroy's eye. They exchanged a short wave before he returned to fitting fairy lights to a crabapple tree. She kept her head down as she reached the main road, and Mr. and Mrs. Burns from the church approached. Briskly, she passed the mini supermarket and turned a sharp right, earbuds in, despite no music playing. They'd provided an effective defence this last year, deflecting attention and upsetting questions. The park had transformed into a Christmas card, as if the night had sponge-painted it with frost. But its beauty couldn't prevent her thoughts from returning to the notebook. She went to sit on one of the benches, but spotted her hairdresser walking her dog, so instead, eyes to the ground, she carried on. "Dolly, how are you, chickie? I've seen you pass the salon a few times. I'm so sorry about—" Dolly needed bigger earbuds. Abruptly, she turned away from the woman who was trying to intrude on her solitude. "There's absolutely no way I'm reading Lost Private Musings," Dolly firmly told herself, as she opened her front door. Only the worst sort of person would delve further into the notebook, and thus earn a terrible punishment, like no Earl Grey for eternity. However, having changed back into her jogging bottoms, she walked past her sister's room. Since losing Greta, Dolly had thought differently about the possessions that had come their way over the years, and how much they might be missed. What if some had sentimental value, and were a gift from a lover, or a hand-me-down from a deceased relative? Items like the vintage ring could never be replaced. Could she really hold on to the case's personal items? Whilst she'd kept all of Greta's, even the clothes that still hung in her old wardrobe. Now and then Dolly took out a cardigan and put it on. The smell of her sister's perfume lingered and made her think of all the fun times they'd shared. Like eating their favourite biscuits in front of the telly. Oat for Greta, chocolate for Dolly. Competitive Greta's face when Dolly secretly let her solve the last crossword clue. And enjoying one of their good-humoured political arguments, Dolly's views leaning to the left, Greta's to the right. Dolly placed a cup of tea on the little table next to the sofa and sat down. The yellow crystal bracelet from the steamer trunk dropped forward to the end of her wrist. On her lap, Monet colours flirted with sunlight streaming through the window. Like a matador waving his cape, Morris gave a disgusted swish of his fan tail and turned away his egg-shaped body as Dolly ran a hand over the notebook's cover. "If you must know, I have an honourable motive," she said in an important voice, "to look for clues that will help me find the case's owner. Aside from returning this notebook, I must give back the personal items. That pearl and diamond ring, this bracelet, and that expensive gilet." She and Greta had once bagged a pair of Jimmy Choo shoes, but they were too worn to be worth much. It was almost as if Greta had sent down lucky vibes, a reward for being brave and going to the auction. A lump rose in Dolly's throat. If only her sister was here. She'd have insisted they'd lunch at a garden centre to celebrate, with a small sherry at home afterwards. Once before Dolly had wanted to track down a case's owner. The 1992 case had contained an antique teddy. It had been kept. Despite missing one eye, it must have meant a lot to somebody. But Greta believed people reconciled themselves to loss, said that going back in time would only bring back hurt and anger. She'd scoffed at Dolly's suggestion to return the teddy. Yet her laugh had sounded forced. Dolly shivered and picked up the notebook again, its purple and green metallic front shimmering. Morris stared her way without breaking his gaze. Not that he could blink anyway. Goldfish slept with their eyes open. Respecting each other's privacy was one reason Dolly and Greta had lived so easily together. They'd never opened each other's post, nor snooped in each other's bedrooms. It was one of the reasons Dolly found it hard to clear out Greta's things, fearful of stumbling across a secret, even though she knew that as sisters they'd shared everything important. Did she owe a stranger the same respect? She flicked to the title page, as far as she'd gone before, and then slowly turned on to the first full page of writing. "I, Phoebe Goodbody, need change. The past 12 months I've not lived. Oh, I've done the essentials, breathed, drunk water, binged Bridgerton, but I've hardly gone out, not spoken to anyone but my grandfather, Susan and Maisie. The world has felt dark and hopeless, as if there's been a permanent solar eclipse. However, now I'm ready to step outside again, to chat about the weather with passers-by as rain splats on my cheeks. But more than that, I need to set challenges in order to stop old habits pulling me back indoors and into myself once more. So every month, I'm going to have an adventure. Do something I've never done before." Some might think the challenges in this notebook are everyday and easy. Others might agree with me that they are positively scary. With the help of a friend, I've chosen ones that will push me to my limit. I don't know how I'm going to do them all, but what's the point of a year of firsts if it doesn't mean stepping outside of your comfort zone? And several will need planning and booking in advance. That should stop me from chickening out. I owe it to Grandad. Even at my age, I know he still worries about me, and he's not as strong as he used to be. I owe it to those friends who aren't lucky enough to still be around. I owe it to the woman I want to be, who's been lurking in the shadows for too many years now, who's hit her rock bottom, had no lower to go, and is now, finally, ready to emerge. A Phoebe rising from the ashes. So Phoebe was the author. It was her story. Dolly tapped fish flakes into Morris's tank before leaving the lounge. She walked down to the right and turned left past the kitchen and into the dining room. Furnished in mahogany, it was the tidiest spot in the bungalow. She'd hardly used it this last year. Unlike her younger sister, Greta preferred the dark wood, due to its durability. Dolly headed to the end and into the much brighter conservatory. She'd decked it out by herself as a surprise for Greta, a place to uplift her when her sister's joints hurt most. Dolly had put a 3-tiered plant stand in the left corner, but instead of using it for flower pots, put on scented candles and a small stack of books, along with an ornamental duck in an anorak, holding an umbrella. Greta's face, when she first saw it, suggested she liked the little room almost as much as Flo next door did. It was just big enough for 2 people, with 2 wicker chairs upholstered in yellow. On top of a leaf-patterned rug, a polished basil green case lay sideways, a perfect table from the 2009 auction. The case had contained nothing but dirty laundry. Pushing a couple of used plates aside, Dolly put the floral purple and green notebook on top of it, along with Greta's white one, listing lost luggage contents. The glass windows, all around, provided a clear spy hole to life in the orderly garden. Or had done when Greta was alive. Grime was smeared across them now. Outside, moss lay deeply entrenched in the lawn. The soil in the borders was hidden by weeds, and an aluminium suitcase from the late 1980s, upcycled into a flower pot, belched out straggly dead plants. She studied the oak love seat, encrusted with pigeon droppings now, where she and Greta often enjoyed sandwiches. Poor Phoebe. Imagine believing you'd not realised your potential. An uncomfortable twinge flicked against the inside of her stomach. It was difficult to guess Phoebe's age. If some friends of hers had already passed, she could be middle-aged, with a grandfather as old as Greta, who was 86 when the worst happened. Phoebe sounded brave and caring. Perhaps the reason she'd hardly gone out in the 12 months before the notebook was written was that he needed looking after. Greta had certainly needed more help with day-to-day life after hitting her 80s, not that she'd ever admitted that she couldn't manage. Dolly's sister had always fought hard for her health, insisting they'd cook from scratch, and she didn't like to overindulge with alcohol. Greta had also jokingly hidden a silver cigarette lighter Dolly had used in her 20s, so Dolly gave up smoking. She still enjoyed takeout, but just as a treat, and only occasionally got a little tipsy. As the years passed, Dolly felt grateful to Greta for encouraging her to follow her sister's lead and look after herself. However, when Greta died, Dolly found no appeal in clean living for one. She'd had to stay strong and healthy to look after her sister, but all alone now that pressure was off. She picked up the white notebook and updated the list in terms of what she'd do with the contents. Greta used to be ruthless about throwing away impractical items straight away, and Dolly did her best to channel that sentiment now. She could have kept everything from the trunk to hopefully return one day, but the truth was she might never find the case's owner. Leather steamer trunk with hidden compartment. Not sure yet how to upcycle. Vintage ring necklace. Return as a priority. Sentimental value. Bracelet. Return might be missed too. Pink and maroon Zadorin gilet. The price of a week in Margate. Return to owner. Old T-shirt. The intriguing symbol is too pretty to throw it away. Keep. baggy sports hoodie with peekaboo cat. Feels like a second skin. Temperamental octopus. The perfect friend for Morris. Mix of baggy casual wear, charity shop. Rose gold and white trainers, keeping. Underwear, bin. Dolly placed the white notebook back on the green case and drummed her fingers. She moved it onto the top of Phoebe's, but the edge of that one's metallic effect cover still temptingly glinted. Crossing her legs, she stared through a smear of dirt and spotted a blackbird outside listening for worms. Tea tonight, she should think about that. But she never planned these days. Freezer food was her staple. The information in the notebook's introduction wouldn't be enough to trace Phoebe. She needed to read more, just a little bit. Anyone could justify that. Morris need never know. Dolly flexed her hands. May, my year of first starts now. You know what they say? Go big or go home, so I'm kicking off with a trip to Paris. There, I've said it. Me going to France is really going to happen. I've wanted to visit my whole life, but haven't considered myself sophisticated enough in case all French women look like Coco Chanel. Well, bugger that, as my grandfather would say. City of Lights, prepare to meet one down-to-earth, born-and-bred Man City fan. Grandad would also say, well done, Phoebes. Fighting talk, lass. By the time I come home, I hope to have visited all the obvious attractions, the Eiffel Tower, Louvre, Sacré-Cœur, the inside-out Pompidou Centre. I'll have eaten croissants and snails, drunk wine and bought a beret, and sat for my caricature to be drawn in Montmartre, dreaming of Gene Kelly and the movie An American in Paris. All in 1 week. Only joking. For my first trip there, I really want to visit Père Lachaise Cemetery, where so many literary greats are buried, and go into Les Deux Magots Café that used to be frequented by Sartre, Hemingway, and de Beauvoir. Makes me sound pretentious. I'm not. It'll just help me reconcile myself with flunking my French degree. It's a lifetime ago I dropped out after the 2nd year. This trip might diminish that sense that I've wasted what I learnt. That's one reason I've really got to see this challenge through, even though going to Paris for me feels like visiting Timbuktu. Maisie suggested this would be the perfect first challenge for an avid reader like me. She's been to the French capital and knows firsthand how fantastic it is for literary spots and fans of independent bookshops. My grandfather's insisted on paying for this trip. He believed me when I said I'd found a half-price room right by the Seine. Well, it wouldn't be an adventure, would it, if I knew exactly where I'd be sleeping? The trip to Paris, the glamour, the style, the magic and romance. Dolly pushed away that rippling ache and reread the page, relieved to think about someone else for a change. This Phoebe sounded approachable, funny, and was no youngster if she knew of Gene Kelly. The year of first began last May. Unless the notebook referred to an earlier year and she'd already completed it. However, that seemed unlikely, given the map of the Paris Underground in the gilet pocket and how new the notebook looked. She would have met half her challenges by now, if she'd continued without these notes. Dolly shivered, a familiar chill she always felt in the days after opening a lost case, a niggling sense that something might have happened to the owner, and that was why they'd never claimed their luggage. She read the page again. Manchester Airport served many customers local to the northwest, and being a Man City fan too, Phoebe might well live in Manchester. She did say born and bred. What a great clue! Dolly's quest to find her might really succeed. Odd that out of all the worries a trip abroad could raise, this Phoebe had been most concerned about looking chic enough. instead of losing a passport or phone or missing a flight, or not having any accommodation booked. Dolly thought croissants and the Eiffel Tower sounded about as exciting as life got, whereas Phoebe was clearly an intellectual and nothing like Dolly. She deserved to have the notebook back, and that would mean reading just a little more. Her hand went to turn the page when a frantic knocking at the door made her jump. Dolly snapped the notebook shut and shoved it behind the ornamental duck, hiding it from herself. Chapter 4. No one had ever rapped on the door like that. They didn't dare when Greta was alive, not even when the new burglar alarm had kept going off. As Dolly was about to investigate, through the lounge window a voice she recognised rang out. Dolly went into the hallway and opened the door. Leroy wrung his hands, as if trying to squeeze words out. Dolly sighed. "I suppose you better come in." He followed her into the lounge. Only 6 people had been allowed in this last year. Leroy, Flo and her parents, the doctor, and the gas man. As Leroy did now, they always looked around for a few moments. Dolly didn't know why. Junk mail, empty tissue boxes, squashed fizzy drink cans, used crockery. It was all so boring. Despite that, now and again Leroy insisted on tidying. His place was vibrant, interesting. Like him, his clothes always looked as if they were hoping for a night on the Raz. The dark slacks fitted well around his bottom and complemented the candy-red shirt, and lemon cravat just above a patch of tantalising curls visible on his chest. Dolly never thought she'd notice such things once she'd retired. Certainly not on a 66-year-old pensioner, not that she'd ever call Leroy the P-word out loud. After a glass of something strong, they used to laugh together, say if things had been different, they might have made the perfect couple. "What is it?" she asked.
"There's the biggest spider on my kitchen wall."
He lifted the palms of his hands in the air.
"I won't sleep tonight if I know it's in the house. I thought about killing it with hairspray, but I'm not sure that would have worked. You're the only person I can ask, Dolly. Anyone else would laugh. Sorry for the ruckus, but we'll have to hurry before it disappears."
Laughs had been few and far between this last year, and now she finally found something funny, she felt duty-bound not to show it.
"Please, Dolly. I'll sign you a blank check. Do anything. Just get rid of it."
Dolly hesitated. An ingrained habit, waiting for Greta to tell her what to do. Her older sister never thought twice about squashing spiders. Picturing the poor creature stuck to the wall with hairspray, Dolly hurried outside, grabbing her brown anorak from the rack on the wall. She followed Leroy to his place. It felt good to be needed. They lived in Pingate Loop, a small circle of 3 bungalows off Pingate Road. Dolly in the middle, Flo and her parents to the left, and Leroy to the right. This last year she'd appreciated the privacy, away from the eyes of the village. It wasn't like Leroy to panic, and with him at 6 feet tall, the spider would have been far more frightened. She made it to the kitchen, that seemed more spacious than hers, without the lace doilies Greta loved, the collection of ceramic teapots and fruit-themed wallpaper. Yet Leroy's had a collection of novelty corkscrews on the windowsill, and photos on the walls from his birthday parties over the years. The main difference was his clean worktops, the empty washing-up bowl, and a bin that didn't overflow with used drink cans and food cartons. She craned her neck to search for the spider, but Leroy led her out of the kitchen. His bungalow was the same L-shaped layout as hers, with 2 bedrooms and a good-sized bathroom at the far end. She walked into the dining room. What a welcoming committee! Bowls of sprouts, carrots and roast potatoes, next to a glistening turkey, along with giant Yorkshire puddings and slices of nutty stuffing. Steam rose out of the gravy jug, and her stomach rumbled. Leroy had set 2 plates, each with a Christmas cracker, Festive pop songs played in the background.
I've been pulling your wheelie bins out all year, Dolly. I knew you wouldn't cook for yourself, and it's no fun eating on my own.
He must have gone to so much effort, even if he had worked as a restaurant manager for over 30 years and picked up cooking tips. Leroy had a cheeky glint in his eye, and, come to think of it, he'd even chased blue bottles outside rather than hurting them. It was one of the things he and Dolly had in common. Greta would have seen straight through this ruse. But don't you usually go to a party in town on Boxing Day?
That's where I met Tony last year.
His voice wavered.
I wanted to go, to see if he was there, but then he's probably with his latest young stallion.
He glanced sideways.
I know, hypocritical. But he's well into his 40s, and going by his Facebook page, his latest squeeze could be my grandson.
Dolly eyed the sumptuous spread once more. She looked down at her worn slippers and joggers bearing a ketchup stain. But this was Leroy. He'd not seen her dressed any other way this last year. That hadn't stopped Dapper him forcing his way in every week to check she was still eating, even if her diet consisted of biscuits, crisps, and anything the microwave could spit out in less than 5 minutes. Dolly took off her anorak and held it out in the air, unable to stop staring at the mouth-watering dishes before her. Leroy took it from her, his attention wrapping her up in a hug of nostalgia from when Greta would make her chicken broth for a bad cold, or fill her a hot water bottle at that time of the month, when she was younger. Dolly settled in a chair, picked up a cracker, and shook it from side to side. They pulled them both at the same time, and duly donned paper hats. Savouring each mouthful, Dolly cleared her plate and declared Tony would never find anyone who made such Moorish Yorkshire pudding. Leroy topped up her wineglass and fetched himself another beer. He took off his hat and smoothed out the creases, as if the paper bore a speech.
I hope this meal would whet your appetite for cooking from scratch again, gal, because I'm not going to be around to drop meals off.
Dolly flinched. Perhaps he was ill? She studied his face, and the eyes that had looked more tired these days.
I'm flying out to Jamaica on New Year's Day.
Leroy visiting the other side of the world? Out of the blue, on his own. Suspicions confirmed. He needed to see a doctor immediately.
I'll be gone for a while.
But why go so far? Dolly had never even owned a passport. Greta was so against flying and travelling abroad. Dolly hadn't minded. Not really. She and her sister always enjoyed comprehensive coach tours around Great Britain. They'd ridden trains in the Scottish Highlands and sailed the Norfolk Broads, visited the home of cheddar cheese, and learnt about Vikings in York.
A second cousin I didn't know about has tracked me down and reached out via Facebook.
Reached out. Greta used to roll her eyes at modern word usages like moving forwards or sorry not sorry.
Winston has invited me over. He lives in the Grill, on the far western tip of the island. I can stay there for up to 90 days without a visa.
But you're British through and through. Born here like your mum. Why would you want her?
It's still family, Dolly. Still part of my roots. A break. Sunshine.
But there's Southport or Blackpool for that. They've got sunny beaches.
At this time of year? Anyway.
Leroy placed his hand on her fingers.
I'm not going there to top up my tan.
She clamped her other hand over his, a realisation flooding her chest of just how much it had meant this last year, knowing Leroy was next door. Mark and Kaz, Flo's parents, had also been very good, bringing around baked gifts, and little Flo would stop for a while. Dolly's young neighbour often used to come over when Greta was around, and made it quite plain that there was no reason that shouldn't continue. Her singing and school chat added a different dimension to a day stuck indoors. But Leroy was the only adult who treated her like the old Dolly, helping out in little ways, inviting her out even though she never said yes. Then there was the time, 3 months ago, when he came around, eyes swollen, voice scratchy. It was the nearest thing she'd had to a night out since Greta died. Leroy sitting in her garden, them sharing a family-sized packet of roasted peanuts, digesting the news that, after 9 months together, Tony had dumped him. "But it's so brave," she whispered. "Flying all that way to a strange country, to stay with strange people. Aren't you a little afraid?"
Honestly, I can't wait. My life needs a shake-up. Sometimes I ask myself where that man went who interrailed around Europe and danced on top of tables whenever Diana Ross played. I broke one in half on my 40th birthday, you know. But now I've become stuck in a rut. I imagine you aren't the same person as you were years ago either. What's happened to us, Dolly? Here we are, trapped in the groove of suburbia, as if it's an LP stuck on repeat. I didn't really think about it until Tony moved out.
The thing was, she was still exactly the same person she'd been. In her late 20s, at least. Life hadn't changed one jot. Since Greta had saved her from a terrible mistake, and they'd moved in together almost 5 decades ago, when Dolly was 25. What with this Phoebe challenging herself to a year of adventures, and Leroy's imminent 1,000-mile trip, a familiar sense of being left behind made Dolly feel hollow, despite the Christmas feast.
Me retiring in the summer triggered our breakup, as if Tony saw that as an end to really living.
The problem with chasing young stallions is that you can't ever tame them. She gave him a beady look. Leroy swigged his beer. She knew he'd always wanted to visit Jamaica, the home of reggae, often humming Eddie Grant's Living on the Front Line, one of his favourites from the 1970s, dreaming that his soulmate was waiting for him, chilling on white sands.
"Come around New Year's Eve?"
he said a couple of hours later, after coffee and mints and Dolly beating him at Cluedo.
"I've bought a bottle of rum to get me in the mood for my trip."
Dolly gave a tentative nod and pulled on her anorak. Going to Jamaica would help him forget Tony. She waved her hand and opened the front door, calling to him without looking back. "That blank cheque you promised if I dealt with the spider, make sure you write it out to Dorothy, not Dolly." Chapter 5. Dolly walked past the still life oil painting in Leroy's hallway, past the large suitcase, and dumped 2 shopping bags in his kitchen, trying to guess the contents of his case and what exciting thing a bidder at the auction might find in it. Soul music boogied out of the lounge. If a place called Motown actually existed, the two of them would move there in an instant. Changing out of her joggers and fleece required too much effort, but she'd half-heartedly applied a slash of lipstick. Whilst Leroy checked his flight time again, Dolly heaved one of the shopping bags onto the kitchen table and took out her flask. Leroy's lips twitched upwards.
"My tea's still not good enough for you, gal."
"You know I'm very fussy when it comes to a cuppa." At least that's what Greta used to say about Dolly, insisting tea tasted the same whether the milk went in first or last. But Dolly could always tell. She pulled out a packet of sausage rolls, tipping them unceremoniously into a bowl. A ready-made, pale-looking quiche followed.